ordinary feats of perception. He was referring to the after effects of ingesting hallucinogenic plants, which I had experienced various times while being submerged in the irrigation ditch behind his house in northern Mexico. "Save any questions until I explain to you what the seers knew about awareness," he said. "Then you'll understand everything we're doing in a different light. But first, let's go on with our procedure." We walked to the nearby stream, and he selected a place with flat, exposed rocks. He said that there, the water was shallow enough for our purposes. "What do you expect to happen?" I asked in the midst of a gripping apprehension. "I don't know. All I know is what we are going to attempt. We will hold the mirror very carefully but very firmly. We will gently place it on the surface of the water and then let it submerge. We will then hold it on the bottom. I've checked it. There's enough silt there to allow us to dig our fingers underneath the mirror to hold it firmly." He asked me to squat on a flat rock above the surface in the middle of the gentle stream and made me hold the mirror with both hands, almost at the corners of one side. He squatted facing me and held the mirror the same way I did. We let the mirror sink, and then we held it by plunging our arms in the water almost to our elbows. He commanded me to empty myself of thoughts and stare at the surface of the mirror. He repeated over and over that the trick was not to think at all. I looked intently into the mirror. The gentle current mildly disarranged the reflection of Don Juan's face and mine. After a few minutes of steady gazing into the mirror, it seemed to me that gradually the image of his face and mine became much clearer, and the mirror grew in size until it was at least a yard square. The current seemed to have stopped, and the mirror looked as clear as if it were placed on top of the water. Even more odd was the crispness of our reflections. It was as if my face had been magnified, not in size, but in focus. I could see the pores in the skin of my forehead. Don Juan gently whispered not to stare at my eyes or his, but to let my gaze wander around without focusing on any part of our reflections. "Gaze fixedly, without staring," he repeatedly ordered in a forceful whisper. I did what he said without stopping to ponder about the seeming contradiction. At that moment, something inside me was caught in that mirror, and the contradiction actually made sense. It is possible to gaze fixedly without staring, I thought, and the instant that thought was formulated, another head appeared next to Don Juan's and mine. It was on the lower side of the mirror, to my left. My whole body trembled. Don Juan whispered to calm down and not show fear or surprise. He again commanded me to gaze without staring at the newcomer. I had to make an unimaginable effort not to gasp and release the mirror. My body was shaking from head to toe. Don Juan whispered again to get hold of myself. He nudged me repeatedly with his shoulder. Slowly, I got my fear under control. I gazed at the third head and gradually realized that it was not a human head or an animal head either. In fact, it was not a head at all. It was a shape that had no inner mobility. As the thought occurred to me, I instantly realized that I was not thinking it myself. The realization was not a thought either. I had a moment of tremendous anxiety, and then something incomprehensible became known to me. The thoughts were a voice in my ear. "I am seeing!" I yelled in English, but there was no sound. "Yes, you're seeing," the voice in my ear said in Spanish. I felt that I was encased in a force greater than myself. I was not in pain or even anguished. I felt nothing. I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt, because the voice was telling me so, that I could not break the grip of that force by an act of will or strength. I knew I was dying. I lifted my eyes automatically to look at Don Juan, and at the instant our eyes met, the force let go of me. I was free. Don Juan was smiling at me, as if he knew exactly what I had gone through. I realized that I was standing up. Don Juan was holding the mirror edgewise to let the water drip off. We walked back to the house in silence. The ancient Toltecs were simply mesmerized by their findings, Don Juan said. I can understand why, I said. So can I, Don Juan retorted. The force that had enveloped me had been so powerful as to incapacitate me for speech, even for thought, for hours afterward. It had frozen me with a total lack of volition, and I had thawed out only by tiny degrees. Without any deliberate intervention on our part, Don Juan continued, this ancient Toltec technique has been divided into two parts for you. The first was just enough to familiarize you with what takes place. In the second, we will try to accomplish what the old seers pursued. What really took place out there, Don Juan? I asked. There are two versions. I'll give you the old seers' version first. They thought that the reflecting surface of a shiny object submerged in water enlarges the power of the water. What they used to do was gaze into bodies of water, and the reflecting surface served them as an aid to accelerate the process. They believed that our eyes are the keys to entering into the unknown. By gazing into water, they were allowing the eyes to open the way. Don Juan said that the old seers observed that the wetness of water only dampens or soaks, but that the fluidity of water moves. It runs, they surmised, in search of other levels underneath us. They believed that water had been given to us not only for life, but also as a link, a road to the other levels below. Are there many levels below? I asked. The ancient seers counted 7 levels, he replied. Do you know them yourself, Don Juan? I am a seer of the new cycle, and consequently, I have a different view, he said. I am just showing you what the old seers did, and I am telling you what they believed. He asserted that just because he had different views did not mean the old seers' practices were invalid. Their interpretations were wrong, but their truths had practical value for them. In the instance of the water practices, they were convinced that it was humanly possible to be transported bodily by the fluidity of water anywhere between this level of ours and the other 7 levels below, or to be transported in essence anywhere on this level along the watercourse of a river in either direction. They used, accordingly, running water to be transported on this level of ours, and the water of deep lakes or that of water holes to be transported to the depths. What they pursued with the technique I'm showing you was twofold, he went on. On the one hand, they used the fluidity of the water to be transported to the first level below. On the other, they used it to have a face-to-face meeting with a living being from that first level. The head-like shape in the mirror was one of those creatures that came to look us over. So they really exist, I exclaimed. They certainly do, he retorted. He said that ancient seers were damaged by their aberrant insistence on staying glued to their procedures, but that whatever they found was valid. They found out that the surest way to meet one of those creatures is through a body of water. The size of the body of water is not relevant. An ocean or a pond serves the same purpose. He had chosen a small stream because he hated to get wet. We could have gotten the same results in a lake or a large river. The other life comes to find out what's going on when human beings call, he continued. That Toltec technique is like a knock on their door. The old seers said the shiny surface of the bottom of the water served as a bait and a window. So humans and those creatures meet at a window. Is that what happened to me there? I asked. The old seers would have said that you were being pulled by the power of the water and the power of the first level, plus the magnetic influence of the creature at the window. But I heard a voice in my ear saying that I was dying, I said. The voice was right. You were dying, and you would have if I hadn't been there. That is the danger of practicing the Toltec's techniques. They are extremely effective, but most of the time, they are deadly. I told him that I was ashamed to confess that I was terrified. Seeing that shape in the mirror and having the sensation of an enveloping force around me had proved too much for me the day before. I don't want to alarm you, he said, but nothing has happened to you yet. If what happened to me is going to be the guideline of what will happen to you, you'd better prepare yourself for the shock of your life. It's better to shake in your boots now than to die of fright tomorrow. My fear was so terrifying that I couldn't even voice the questions that came to my mind. I had a hard time swallowing. Don Juan laughed until he was coughing. His face got purple. When I got my voice back, every one of my questions prompted another attack of coughing laughter. You have no idea how funny this all is to me, he finally said. I'm not laughing at you. It's just the situation. My benefactor made me go through the same motions, and looking at you, I can't help seeing myself. I told him that I felt sick to my stomach. He said that that was fine, that it was natural to be scared, and that to control fear was wrong and senseless. The ancient seers got trapped by suppressing their terror when they should have been scared out of their wits. Since they didn't want to stop their pursuits or abandon their comforting constructs, they controlled their fear instead. What else are we going to do with the mirror? I asked. That mirror is going to be used for a face-to-face meeting between you and that creature you only gazed at yesterday. What happens in a face-to-face meeting? What happens is that one form of life, the human form, meets another form of life. The old seer said that in this case, it is a creature from the first level of the fluidity of water. He explained that the ancient seers surmised that the 7 levels below ours were levels of the fluidity of water. For them, a spring had untold significance because they thought that in such a case, the fluidity of water is reversed and goes from the depth to the surface. They took that to be the means whereby creatures from other levels, these other forms of life, come to our plane to peer at us, to observe us. In this respect, those old seers were not mistaken, he went on. They hit the nail right on the head. Entities that the new seers call allies do appear around waterholes. Was the creature in the mirror an ally? I asked. Of course, but not one that can be utilized. The tradition of the allies, which I have acquainted you with in the past, comes directly from the ancient seers. They did wonders with allies, but nothing they did was worth anything when the real enemy came along. Their fellow men. Since those creatures are allies, they must be very dangerous, I said. As dangerous as we men are. No more, no less. Can they kill us? Not directly, but they certainly can frighten us to death. They can cross the boundaries themselves, or they can just come to the window. As you may have realized by now, the ancient Toltecs didn't stop at the window either. They found weird ways to go beyond it. The second stage of the technique proceeded very much as had the first, except that it took perhaps twice as long for me to relax and and stop my internal turmoil. When that was done, the reflection of Don Juan's face and mine became instantly clear. I gazed from his reflection to mine for perhaps an hour. I expected the ally to appear at any moment, but nothing happened. My neck hurt. My back was stiff and my legs were numb. I wanted to kneel on the rock to relieve the pain in my lower back. Don Juan whispered that the moment the ally showed its shape, my discomfort would vanish. He was absolutely right. The shock of witnessing a round shape appear on the edge of the mirror dispelled every discomfort of mine. "What do we do now?" I whispered. "Relax, and don't focus your gaze on anything, not even for an instant," he replied. "Watch everything that appears in the mirror. Gaze without staring." I obeyed him. I glanced at everything within the frame of the mirror. There was a peculiar buzzing in my ears. Don Juan whispered that I should move my eyes in a clockwise direction if I felt that I was being enveloped by an unusual force, but under no circumstances, he stressed, should I lift my head to look at him. After a moment, I noticed that the mirror was reflecting more than the reflection of our faces and the round shape. Its surface had become dark. Spots of an intense violet light appeared. They grew large. There were also spots of jet blackness. Then it turned into something like a flat picture of a cloudy sky at night, in the moonlight. Suddenly, the whole surface came into focus as if it were a moving picture. The new sight was a three-dimensional, breathtaking view of the depths. I knew that it was absolutely impossible for me to fight off the tremendous attraction of that sight. It began to pull me in. Don Juan whispered forcefully that I should roll my eyes for dear life. The movement brought immediate relief. I could again distinguish our reflections and that of the ally. Then, the ally disappeared and reappeared again on the other end of the mirror. Don Juan commanded me to grip the mirror with all my might. He warned me to be calm and not make any sudden movements. "What's going to happen?" I whispered. "The ally will try to come out," he replied. As soon as he had said that, I felt a powerful tug. Something jerked my arms. The tug was from underneath the mirror. It was like a suction force that created a uniform pressure all around the frame. "Hold the mirror tightly, but don't break it," Don Juan ordered. "Fight the suction. Don't let the ally sink the mirror too deep." The force pulling down on us was enormous. I felt that my fingers were going to break or be crushed against the rocks on the bottom. Don Juan and I both lost our balance at one point and had to step down from the flat rocks into the stream. The water was quite shallow, but the thrashing of the allies' force around the frame of the mirror was as frightening as if we had been in a large river. The water around our feet was being swirled around madly, but the images in the mirror were undisturbed. "Watch out!" Don Juan yelled. "Here it comes!" The tugging changed into a thrust from underneath. Something was grabbing the edge of the mirror, not the outer edge of the frame where we were holding it, but from the inside of the glass. It was as if the glass surface were indeed an open window, and something or somebody were just climbing through it. Don Juan and I fought desperately, either to push the mirror down when it was being thrust up, or pull it up when it was being tugged downward. In a stooped-over position, we slowly moved downstream from the original spot. The water was deeper, and the bottom was covered with slippery rocks. "Let's lift the mirror out of the water and shake him loose," Don Juan said in a harsh voice. The loud thrashing continued unremittingly. It was as if we had caught an enormous fish with our bare hands and it was swimming around wildly. It occurred to me that the mirror was, in essence, a hatch. A strange shape was actually trying to climb up through it. It was leaning on the edge of the hatch with a mighty weight and was big enough to displace the reflection of Don Juan's face and mine. I couldn't see us anymore. I could only distinguish a mass trying to push itself up. The mirror was not resting on the bottom anymore. My fingers were not compressed against the rocks. The mirror was in mid-depth, held by the opposing forces of the Allies' tugs and ours. Don Juan said he was going to extend his hands underneath the mirror and that I should very quickly grab them in order to have a better leverage to lift the mirror with our forearms. When he let go, it tilted to his side. I quickly reached for his hands, but there was nothing underneath. I vacillated a second too long, and the mirror flew out of my hands. "Grab it! Grab it!" Don Juan yelled. I caught the mirror just as it was going to land on the rocks. I lifted it out of the water, but not quickly enough. The water seemed to be like glue. As I pulled the mirror out, I also pulled a portion of a heavy, rubbery substance that simply pulled the mirror out of my hands and back into the water. Don Juan, displaying extraordinary nimbleness, caught the mirror and lifted it up edgewise without any difficulty. Never in my life had I had such an attack of melancholy. It was a sadness that had no precise foundation. I associated it with the memory of the depths I had seen in the mirror. It was a mixture of pure longing for those depths, plus an absolute fear of their chilling solitude. Don Juan remarked that in the life of warriors, it was extremely natural to be sad for no overt reason. Seers say that the luminous egg, as a field of energy, senses its final destination whenever the boundaries of the known are broken. A mere glimpse of the eternity outside the cocoon is enough to disrupt the coziness of our inventory. The resulting melancholy is sometimes so intense that it can bring about death. He said that the best way to get rid of melancholy is to make fun of it. He commented in a mocking tone that my first attention was doing everything to restore the order that had been disrupted by my contact with the Ally. Since there was no way of restoring it by rational means, my first attention was doing it by focusing all its power on sadness. I told him that the fact remained the melancholy was real. Indulging in it, moping around, being gloomy were not part of the feeling of aloneness that I had felt upon remembering those depths. "Something is finally getting through to you," he said. "You're right. There is nothing more lonely than eternity, and nothing is more cozy for us than to be a human being. This indeed is another contradiction. How can man keep the bonds of his humanness and still venture gladly and purposefully into the absolute loneliness of eternity? Whenever you resolve this riddle, you'll be ready for the definitive journey." I knew then, with total certainty, the reason for my sadness. It was a recurrent feeling with me, one that I would always forget until I again realized the same thing. The puniness of humanity against the immensity of that thing in itself which I had seen reflected in the mirror. "Human beings are truly nothing, Don Juan," I said. "I know exactly what you're thinking," he said. "Sure, we're nothing. But that's exactly what makes it the ultimate challenge, that we nothings could actually face the loneliness of eternity." He abruptly changed the subject, leaving me with my mouth open, my next question unsaid. He began to discuss our bout with the Ally. He said that, first of all, the struggle with the Ally had been no joke. It had not really been a matter of life or death, but it had not been a picnic either. "I chose that technique," he went on, "because my benefactor showed it to me. When I asked him to give me an example of the old seer's techniques, he nearly split a gut laughing. My request reminded him so much of his own experience. His benefactor, the Nagual Elias, had also given him a harsh demonstration of the same technique." Don Juan said that As he had made the frame for his mirror out of wood, he should have asked me to do the same, but he wanted to know what would happen if the frame was sturdier than his or his benefactor's. Both of their frames broke, and both times the ally came out. He explained that during his own bout, the ally ripped the frame apart. He and his benefactor were left holding 2 pieces of wood while the mirror sank, and the ally climbed out of it. His benefactor knew what kind of trouble to expect. In the reflection of mirrors, allies are not really frightening because one sees only a shape, a mass of sorts. But when they are out, besides being truly fearsome-looking things, they are a pain in the neck. He remarked that once the allies get out of their level, it is very difficult for them to go back. The same prevails for man. If seers venture into a level of those creatures, chances are they are never heard of again. My mirror was shattered through the allies' force, he said. There was no more window, and the ally couldn't go back, so it came after me. It actually ran after me, rolling on itself. I scrambled on all fours at top speed, screaming with terror. I went up and down hills like a possessed man. The ally was inches away from me the whole time. Don Juan said that his benefactor ran after him, but he was too old and could not move fast enough. He had the good sense, however, to tell Don Juan to backtrack, and in that way was able to take measures to get rid of the ally. He shouted that he was going to build a fire and that Don Juan should run in circles until everything was ready. He went ahead to gather dry branches, while Don Juan ran around a hill, driven mad with fear. Don Juan confessed that the thought had occurred to him as he ran around in circles that his benefactor was actually enjoying the whole thing. He knew that his benefactor was a warrior, capable of finding delight in any conceivable situation. Why not also in this one? For a moment, he got so angry at his benefactor that the ally stopped chasing him, and Don Juan, in no uncertain terms, accused his benefactor of malice. His benefactor didn't answer, but made a gesture of genuine horror as he looked past Don Juan at the ally, which was looming over the two of them. Don Juan forgot his anger and began running around in circles again. My benefactor was indeed a devilish old man, Don Juan said, laughing. He had learned to laugh internally. It wouldn't show on his face, so he could pretend to be weeping or raging when he was really laughing. That day, as the ally chased me in circles, my benefactor stood there and defended himself from my accusations. I only heard bits of his long speech every time I ran by him. When he was through with that, I heard bits of another long explanation, that he had to gather a great deal of wood, that the ally was big, that the fire had to be as big as the ally itself, that the maneuver might not work. Only my maddening fear kept me going. Finally, he must have realized that I was about to drop dead from exhaustion. He built the fire, and with the flames, he shielded me from the ally. Don Juan said that they stayed by the fire for the entire night. The worst time for him was when his benefactor had to go away to look for more dry branches and left him alone. He was so afraid that he promised to God that he was going to leave the path of knowledge and become a farmer. In the morning, after I had exhausted all my energy, the ally managed to shove me into the fire, and I was badly burned, Don Juan added. What happened to the ally? I asked. My benefactor never told me what happened to it, he replied, but I have the feeling that it is still running around aimlessly, trying to find its way back. And what happened to your promise to God? My benefactor said not to worry, that it had been a good promise, but that I didn't know yet that there is no one to hear such promises, because there is no God. All there is the eagle's emanations, and there is no way to make promises to them. What would have happened if the ally had caught you? I asked. I might have died of fright, he said. If I had known what was entailed in being caught, I would have let it catch me. At that time, I was a reckless man. Once an ally catches you, you either have a heart attack and die, or you wrestle with it. Then after a moment of thrashing around in a sham ferocity, the ally's energy wanes. There is nothing that an ally can do to us, or vice versa. We are separated by an abyss. The ancient seers believed that at the moment the ally's energy dwindles, the ally surrenders its power to man. Power, my eye. The old seers had allies coming out of their ears, and their allies' power didn't mean a thing. Don Juan explained that once again it had been up to the new seers to straighten out this confusion. They had found that the only thing that counts is impeccability, that is, freed energy. There were, indeed, some among the ancient seers who were saved by their allies, but that had nothing to do with the allies' power to fend off anything. Rather, it was the impeccability of the men that had permitted them to use the energy of those other forms of life. The new seers also found out the most important thing yet about the allies: what makes them useless or usable to man. Useless allies, of which there are staggering numbers, are those that have emanations inside them for which we have no match inside ourselves. They are so different from us as to be thoroughly unusable. Other allies, which are remarkably few in number, are akin to us, meaning that they possess occasional emanations that match ours. How is that kind utilized by man? I asked. We should use another word instead of utilize, he replied. I'd say that what takes place between seers and allies of this kind is a fair exchange of energy. How does the exchange take place? I asked. Through their matching emanations, he said. Those emanations are naturally on the left side awareness of man, the side that the average man never uses. For this reason, allies are totally barred from the world of the right side awareness, or the side of rationality. He said that the matching emanations give both a common ground. Then, with familiarity, a deeper link is established, which allows both forms of life to profit. Seers seek the allies' ethereal quality. They make fabulous scouts and guardians. Allies seek the greater energy field of man, and with it, they can even materialize themselves. He assured me that experienced seers play those shared emanations until they bring them into total focus. The exchange takes place at that time. The ancient seers did not understand this process, and they developed complex techniques of gazing in order to descend into the depths that I had seen in the mirror. The old seers had a very elaborate tool to help them in their descent, he went on. It was a rope of special twine that they tied around their waist. It had a soft butt soaked in resin, which fitted into the navel itself like a plug. The seers had an assistant or a number of them who held them by the rope, while they were lost in their gazing. Naturally, to gaze directly into the reflection of a deep, clear pond or lake is infinitely more overwhelming and dangerous than what we did with the mirror. But did they actually descend bodily? I asked. You'd be surprised what men are capable of, especially if they control awareness, he replied. The old seers were aberrant. In their excursions to the depths, they found marvels. It was routine for them to encounter allies. Of course, by now you realize that to say the depths is a figure of speech. There are no depths. There is only the handling of awareness. Yet the old seers never made that realization. I told Don Juan that from what he had said about his experience with the ally, plus my own subjective impression on feeling the allies' thrashing force in the water, I had concluded that allies are very aggressive. Not really, he said. It is not that they don't have enough energy to be aggressive, but rather that they have a different kind of energy. They are more like an electric current. Organic beings are more like heat waves. But why did it chase you for such a long time? I asked. That's no mystery, he said. They are attracted to emotions. Animal fear is what attracts them the most. It releases the kind of energy that suits them. The emanations inside them are rallied by animal fear. Since my fear was relentless, the ally went after it, or rather my fear hooked the ally and didn't let it go. He said that it was the old seers who found out that allies enjoy animal fear more than anything else. They even went to the extreme of purposefully feeding it to their allies by actually scaring people to death. The old seers were convinced that the allies had human feelings, but the new seers saw it differently. They saw that allies are attracted to the energy released by emotions. Love is equally effective, as well as hatred or sadness. Don Juan added that if he had felt love for that ally, the ally would have come after him anyway, although the chase would have had a different mood. I asked him whether the ally would have stopped going after him if he had controlled his fear. He answered that controlling fear was a trick of the old seers. They learned to control it to the point of being able to parcel it out. They hooked their allies with their own fear, and by gradually doling it out like food, they actually held the allies in bondage. Those old seers were terrifying men, Don Juan continued. I shouldn't use the past tense. They are terrifying even today. Their bid is to dominate, to master everybody and everything. Even today, Don Juan? I asked, trying to get him to explain further. He changed the subject by commenting that I had missed the opportunity of being really scared beyond measure. He said that doubtless the way I had sealed the frame of the mirror with tar had prevented the water from seeping behind the glass. He counted that as the deciding factor that had kept the ally from smashing the mirror. Too bad, he said. You might have even liked that ally. By the way, it was not the same one that came the day before. The second one was perfectly akin to you. Don't you have some allies yourself, Don Juan? I asked. As you know, I have my benefactor's allies, he said. I can't say that I have the same feeling for them that my benefactor did. He was a serene but thoroughly passionate man who lavishly gave away everything he possessed, including his energy. He loved his allies. To him, it was no sweat to allow the allies to use his energy and materialize themselves. There was one in particular that could even take a grotesque human form. Don Juan went on to say that since he was not partial to allies, he had never given me a real taste of them as his benefactor had done to him while he was still recovering from the wound in his chest. It all began with the thought that his benefactor was a strange man. Having barely escaped from the clutches of the petty tyrant, Don Juan suspected that he had fallen into another trap. His intention was to wait a few days to get his strength back and then run away when the old man was not home. But the old man must have read his thoughts, because one day in a confidential tone, he whispered to Don Juan that he ought to get well as quickly as possible so that the two of them could escape from his captor and tormentor. Then, shaking with fear and impotence, the old man flung the door open, and a monstrous, fish-faced man came into the room as if he had been listening behind the door. He was a grayish-green, had only one huge, unblinking eye, and was as big as a door. Don Juan said that he was so surprised and terrified that he passed out, and it took him years to get out from under the spell of that fright. Are your allies useful to you, Don Juan? I asked. That's a very difficult thing to decide, he said. In some way, I love the allies my benefactor gave me. They are capable of giving back inconceivable affection. But they are incomprehensible to me. They were given to me for companionship in case I am ever stranded alone in that immensity that is the Eagle's emanations. Chapter 7. The Assemblage Point. Don Juan discontinued his explanation of the mastery of awareness for several months after my bout with the Allies. One day, he started it again. A strange event triggered it. Don Juan was in northern Mexico. It was late afternoon. I had just arrived at the house he kept there, and he immediately had me shift into heightened awareness. And I had instantly remembered that Don Juan always came back to Sonora as means of renewal. He had explained that a Nagual, being a leader who has tremendous responsibilities, has to have a physical point of reference, a place where an amenable confluence of energies occurs. The Sonoran Desert was such a place for him. On entering into heightened awareness, I had noticed that there was another person hiding in the semi-darkness inside the house. I asked Don Juan if Genaro was with him. He replied that he was alone, that what I had noticed was one of his allies, the one that guarded the house. Don Juan then made a strange gesture. He contorted his face as if he were surprised or terrified. And instantly, the frightening shape of a strange man appeared at the door of the room where we were. The presence of the strange man scared me so much that I actually felt dizzy, and before I could recuperate from my fright, the man lurched at me with a chilling ferocity. As he grabbed my forearms, I felt a jolt of something quite like a discharge of an electric current. I was speechless, caught in a terror I could not dispel. Don Juan was smiling at me. I mumbled and groaned, trying to voice a plea for help while I felt an even greater jolt. The man tightened his grip and tried to throw me backward on the ground. Don Juan, with no hurry in his voice, urged me to pull myself together and not fight my fear, but roll with it. Be afraid without being terrified, he said. Don Juan came to my side and, without intervening in my struggle, whispered in my ear that I should put all my concentration on the midpoint of my body. Over the years, he had insisted that I measure my body to the 100th of an inch and establish its exact midpoint, lengthwise as well as in width. He had always said that such a point is a true center of energy in all of us. As soon as I had focused my attention on that midpoint, the man let go of me. At that instant, I became aware that what I had thought was a human being was something that only looked like one. The moment it lost its human shape to me, the ally became an amorphous blob of opaque light. It moved away. I went after it, moved by a great force that made me follow that opaque light. Don Juan stopped me. He gently walked me to the porch of his house and made me sit down on a sturdy crate he used as a bench. I was terribly disturbed by the experience, but even more disturbed by the fact that my paralyzing fear had disappeared so fast and so completely. I commented on my abrupt change of mood. Don Juan said that there was nothing strange about my volatile change and that fear did not exist as soon as the glow of awareness moved beyond a certain threshold inside man's cocoon. He then began his explanation. He briefly outlined the truths about awareness he had discussed, that there is no objective world, but only a universe of energy fields which seers call the Eagle's emanations, that human beings are made of the Eagle's emanations and are in essence bubbles of luminescent energy. Each of us is wrapped in a cocoon that encloses a small portion of these emanations. That awareness is achieved by the constant pressure that the emanations outside our cocoons, which are called emanations at large, exert on those inside our cocoons. That awareness gives rise to perception, which happens when the emanations inside our cocoons align themselves with the corresponding emanations at large. The next truth is that perception takes place, he went on, because there is in each of us an agent called the assemblage point that selects internal and external emanations for alignment. The particular alignment that we perceive as the world is the product of the specific spot where our assemblage point is located on our cocoon. He repeated this several times, allowing me time to grasp it. Then he said that in order to corroborate the truths about awareness, I needed energy. I've mentioned to you, he continued, that dealing with petty tyrants helps seers accomplish a sophisticated maneuver. That maneuver is to move their assemblage points. He said that for me to have perceived an ally meant that I had moved my assemblage point away from its customary position. In other words, my glow of awareness had moved beyond a certain threshold, also erasing my fear, and all this had happened because I had enough surplus energy. Later that night, after we had returned from a trip into the surrounding mountains, which had been part of his teachings for the right side, Don Juan had me shift again into heightened awareness and then continued his explanation. He told me that in order to discuss the nature of the assemblage point, he had to start with the discussion of the first attention. He said that the new seers looked into the unnoticed ways in which the first attention functions, and as they tried to explain them to others, they devised an order for the truths about awareness. He assured me that not every seer is given to explaining. For example, his benefactor, the Nagual Julian, could not have cared less about explanations. But the Nagual Julian's benefactor, the Nagual Elias, whom Don Juan was fortunate enough to meet, did care. Between the Nagual Elias's detailed, lengthy explanations, the Nagual Julian's scanty ones, and his own personal seeing, Don Juan came to understand and to corroborate those truths. Don Juan explained that in order for our first attention to bring into focus the world that we perceive, it has to emphasize certain emanations selected from the narrow band of emanations where man's awareness is located. The discarded emanations are still within our reach but remain dormant, unknown to us for the duration of our lives. The new seers call the emphasized emanations the right side, normal awareness, the tonal, this world, the known, the first attention. The average man calls it reality, rationality, common sense. The emphasized emanations compose a large portion of man's band of awareness, but a very small piece of the total spectrum of emanations present inside the cocoon of man. The disregarded emanations within man's band are thought of as a sort of preamble to the unknown proper, consisting of the bulk of emanations which are not part of the human band and which are never emphasized. Seers call them the left side awareness, the Nagual, the other world, the unknown, the second attention. This process of emphasizing certain emanations, Don Juan went on, was discovered and practiced by the old seers. They realized that a Nagual man or a Nagual woman, by the fact that they have extra strength, can push the emphasis away from the usual emanations and make it shift to neighboring ones. That push is known as the Nagual's blow. Don Juan said that the shift was utilized by the old seers in practical ways to keep their apprentices in bondage. With that blow, they made their apprentices enter into a state of heightened, keenest, most impressionable awareness. While they were helplessly pliable, the old seers taught them aberrant techniques that made the apprentices into sinister men, just like their teachers. The new seers employ the same technique, but instead of using it for sordid purposes, they use it to guide their apprentices to learn about man's possibilities. Don Juan explained that the Nagual's blow has to be delivered on a precise spot, on the assemblage point, which varies minutely from person to person. Also, the blow has to be delivered by a Nagual who sees. He assured me that it is equally useless to have the strength of a Nagual and not see, as it is to see and not have the strength of a Nagual. In either case, the results are just blows. A seer could strike on the precise spot over and over without the strength to move awareness, and a non-seeing Nagual would not be able to strike the precise spot. He also said that the old seers discovered that the assemblage point is not in the physical body, but in the luminous shell, in the cocoon itself. The Nagual identifies that spot by its intense luminosity and pushes it rather than striking it. The force of the push creates a dent in the cocoon, and it is felt like a blow to the right shoulder blade, a blow that knocks all the air out of the lungs. Are there different types of dents? I asked. There are only two types, he responded. One is a concavity, and the other is a crevice. Each has a distinct effect. The concavity is a temporary feature and produces a temporary shift, but the crevice is a profound and permanent feature of the cocoon and produces a permanent shift. He explained that usually a luminous cocoon hardened by self-reflection is not affected at all by the Nagual's blow. Sometimes, however, the cocoon of man is very pliable, and the smallest force creates a bowl-like dent ranging in size from a small depression to one that is a third the size of the total cocoon, or it creates a crevice that may run across the width of the egg-like shell, or along its length, making the cocoon look as if it had curled in on itself. Some luminous shells, after being dented, go back to their original shape instantly. Others remain dented for hours or even days at a time, but they revert back by themselves. Still others get a firm, impervious dent that requires another blow from the Nagual on a bordering area to restore the original shape of the luminous cocoon. And a few never lose their indentation once they get it. No matter how many blows they get from a Nagual, they never revert back to their egg-like shapes. Don Juan further said that the dent acts on the first attention by displacing the glow of awareness. The dent presses the emanations inside the luminous shell, and the seers witness how the first attention shifts its emphasis under the force of that pressure. The dent, by displacing the eagle's emanations inside the cocoon, makes the glow of awareness fall on other emanations from areas that are ordinarily inaccessible to the first attention. I asked him if the glow of awareness is seen only on the surface of the luminous cocoon. He didn't answer me right away. He seemed to immerse himself in thought. After perhaps 10 minutes, he answered my question. He said that normally the glow of awareness is seen on the surface of the cocoon of all sentient beings. After man develops attention, however, the glow of awareness acquires depth. In other words, it is transmitted from the surface of the cocoon to quite a number of emanations inside the cocoon. The old seers knew what they were doing when they handled awareness, he went on. They realized that by creating a dent in the cocoon of man, they could force the glow of awareness, since it is already glowing on the emanations inside the cocoon, to spread to other neighboring ones. You make it all sound as if it's a physical affair, I said. How can dents be made in something that is just a glow? In some inexplicable way, it is a matter of a glow that creates a dent in another glow, he replied. Your flaw is to remain glued to the inventory of reason. Reason doesn't deal with man as energy. Reason deals with instruments that create energy, but it has never seriously occurred to reason that we are better than instruments. We are organisms that create energy. We are a bubble of energy. It isn't far-fetched, then, that a bubble of energy would make a dent in another bubble of energy. He said that the glow of awareness created by the dent should rightfully be called temporary heightened attention, because it emphasizes emanations that are so proximal to the habitual ones that the change is minimal. Yet the shift produces a greater capacity to understand and to concentrate, and above all, a greater capacity to forget. Seers knew exactly how to use this upshift in the scale of quality. They saw that only the emanations surrounding those we use daily suddenly become bright after the Nagual's blow. The more distant ones remain unmoved, which meant to them that while being in a state of heightened attention, human beings could work as if they were in the world of everyday life. The need of a Nagual man and a Nagual woman became paramount to them, because that state lasts only for as long as the depression remains, after which the experiences are immediately forgotten. Why does one have to forget? I asked. Because the emanations that account for greater clarity cease to be emphasized once warriors are out of heightened awareness, he replied. Without that emphasis, whatever they experience or witness vanishes. Don Juan said that one of the tasks the new seers had devised for their students was to force them to remember, that is, to re-emphasize by themselves at a later time those emanations used during states of heightened awareness. He reminded me that Genaro was always recommending to me that I learn to write with the tip of my finger instead of a pencil, so as to not accumulate notes. Don Juan said that what Genaro had actually meant was that while I was in states of heightened awareness, I should utilize some unused emanations for storage of dialogue and experience, and someday recall it all by re-emphasizing the emanations that were used. He went on to explain that a state of heightened awareness is seen not only as a glow that goes deeper inside the egg-like shape of human beings, but also as a more intense glow on the surface of the cocoon. Yet it is nothing in comparison to the glow produced by a state of total awareness, which is seen as a burst of incandescence in the entire luminous egg. It is an explosion of light of such a magnitude that the boundaries of the shell are diffused and the inside emanations extend themselves beyond anything imaginable. Are those special cases, Don Juan? Certainly. They happen only to seers. No other men or any other living creatures brighten up like that. Seers who deliberately attain total awareness are a sight to behold. That is the moment when they burn from within. The fire from within consumes them, and in full awareness, they fuse themselves to the emanations at large and glide into eternity. After a few days in Sonora, I drove Don Juan back to the town in the southern part of Mexico where he and his party of warriors lived. The next day was hot and hazy. I felt lazy and somehow annoyed. In mid-afternoon, there was a most unpleasant quietude in that town. Don Juan and I were sitting on the comfortable chairs in the big room. I told him that life in rural Mexico was not my cup of tea. I disliked the feeling I had that the silence of that town was forced. The only noise I ever heard was the sound of children's voices yelling in the distance. I was never able to find out whether they were playing or yelling in pain. When you're here, you're always in a state of heightened awareness, Don Juan said. That makes a great difference. But no matter what, you should be getting used to living in a town like this. Someday you will live in one. Why should I have to live in a town like this, Don Juan? I've explained to you that the new seers aim to be free, and freedom has the most devastating implications. Among them is the implication that warriors must purposely seek change. Your predilection is to live the way you do. You stimulate your reason by running through your inventory and pitting it against your friends' inventories. Those maneuvers leave you very little time to examine yourself and your fate. You will have to give up all that. Likewise, if all you knew were the dead calm of this town, you'd have to seek, sooner or later, the other side of the coin. Is that what you're doing here, Don Juan? Our case is a little bit different because we are at the end of our trail. We are not seeking anything. What all of us do here is something comprehensible only to a warrior. We go from day to day, doing nothing. We are waiting. I will not tire of repeating this. We know that we are waiting, and we know what we are waiting for. We are waiting for freedom. And now that you know that, he added with a grin, let's get back to our discussion of awareness. Usually when we were in that room, we were never interrupted by anyone, and Don Juan would always decide on the length of our discussions. But this time, there was a polite knock on the door, and Genaro walked in and sat down. I hadn't seen Genaro since the day after we had run out of his house in a great hurry. I embraced him. Genaro has something to tell you, Don Juan said. I've told you that he is the master of awareness. Now, I can tell you what all that means. He can make the assemblage point move deeper into the luminous egg after that point has been jolted out of its position by the Nagual's blow. He explained that Genaro had pushed my assemblage point countless times after I had attained heightened awareness. The day we had gone to the gigantic flat rock to talk, Genaro had made my assemblage point move dramatically into the left side, so dramatically, in fact, that it had been a bit dangerous. Don Juan stopped talking and seemed to be ready to give Genaro the spotlight. He nodded, as if to signal Genaro to say something. Genaro stood up and came to my side. Flame is very important, he said softly. Do you remember the day when I made you look at the reflection of the sunlight on a piece of quartz when we were sitting on that big flat rock? When Genaro mentioned it, I remembered. On that day, just after Don Juan had stopped talking, Genaro had pointed to the refraction of light as it went through a piece of polished quartz that he had taken out of his pocket and placed on the flat rock. The shine of the quartz had immediately caught my attention. The next thing I knew, I was crouching on the flat rock as Don Juan stood by with a worried look on his face. I was about to tell Genaro what I had remembered when he began to talk. He put his mouth to my ear and pointed to one of the 2 gasoline lamps in the room. Look at the flame, he said. There is no heat in it. It's pure flame. Pure flame can take you to the depths of the unknown. As he talked, I began to feel a strange pressure. It was a physical heaviness. My ears were buzzing, my eyes teared to the point that I could hardly make out the shape of the furniture. My vision seemed to be totally out of focus. Although my eyes were open, I couldn't see the intense light of the gasoline lamps. Everything around me was dark. There were streaks of chartreuse phosphorescence that illuminated dark, moving clouds. Then, as abruptly as it had faded away, my eyesight returned. I could not make out where I was. I seemed to be floating like a balloon. I was alone. I had a pang of terror, and my reason rushed in to construct an explanation that made sense to me at that moment. Genaro had hypnotized me, using the flame of the gasoline lamp. I felt almost satisfied. I quietly floated, trying not to worry. I thought that a way to avoid worrying was to concentrate on the stages that I would have to go through to wake up. The first thing I noticed was that I was not myself. I could not really look at anything because I had nothing to look with. When I tried to examine my body, I realized that I could only be aware, and yet it was as if I were looking down into infinite space. There were portentous clouds of brilliant light and masses of blackness. Both were in motion. I clearly saw a ripple of amber glow that was coming at me like an enormous, slow ocean wave. I knew then that I was like a buoy